As we saw earlier, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister trying to get this tax debate back on their preferred path today, both giving speeches at an economic forum in Melbourne. Scott Morrison in particular, not wanting to talk about the GST, which everyone else has been talking about this week, instead wanting to focus on income tax and why we're all paying too much income tax, what needs to be done about bracket creep in particular. That's the why when we talk about tax reform rather than the what, as he says, exactly what we'll do with the GST or other taxes. Well, there are a number of government backbenchers who are pretty anxious about this whole debate this week, anxious that we could see an increase in the overall tax take. That's not something they want to see at all. They're making that loud and clear. One of them is Angus Taylor, who joins me now. Thank you for your time. So let's start with this question that Scott Morrison says we need to focus on. Why? I mean, do we need tax reform and why do you think?
Well, we need economic reform. There's two fundamental problems here. One is, as Scott rightly pointed out, tax rates for income tax and company tax are too high. And one of the reasons for that on the income tax side is bracket creep. So tax rates are actually going up every year for the average Australian in an extraordinary way.
Thanks to inflation.
Thanks to inflation. So that's problem number one. Those taxes are too high, and then there's a bunch of other bad state taxes that we need to deal with. The second problem is that our spending growth is too high. And you know, the simple fact of the matter is spending has been growing faster than income for years, structural spending.
Even over the last couple of years?
We've contained that in the last couple of years, but the underlying programs are still growing too fast, like health and welfare and higher education. And we have to contain that, or else you have ever-increasing tax rates. So they're the two fundamental problems. And if solving those problems is part of a broader package, as well as all the compensation you've got to do as part of it, then we can get to a good outcome. If the package doesn't include those things, then we won't get to a good outcome.
All right, so if we have two main problems, one is a spending increase that needs to be brought under control, and the other is income taxes being too high that it's a disincentive to work, to invest, all those sort of things. What then do you see as the solution? Is it increasing other taxes to bring down income taxes?
Well, the starting point is to be very clear about what the problem is that you're trying to solve, as I say, and that's, if you haven't got that clear, then you're nowhere. And this bracket creep is completely insidious. If we put out an announcement at the beginning of each year that your tax rates have just gone up, there'd be a mutiny in Australia. But that's actually what happens every year. That's what bracket creep's doing to us. And if we said to the average Australian, our spending is going up faster than our income, and that means you're going to have ever-increasing tax rates, because that's the maths of it.
So they're two sides of the same coin, aren't they? I mean, spending is going up and we're paying for it thanks to bracket creep.
That's it.
So how do you tackle both of those?
So the way you tackle it, ultimately, is you have to contain income tax rates or bring them down and stop bracket creep automatically occurring. And you can only do that if you contain the growth in spending.
Okay, so the government has tried, Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey in 2014 with the GP co-payment, higher education deregulation, to bring spending under control. And I know there are still efforts underway on a number of fronts, but what's the key here?
Well, we're talking a lot about innovation, and we're talking a lot about the digital economy and how that's going to be great for Australia. Well, for me, the starting point is to apply those things in government. What Australians want to see is not government preach about how they should be more innovative. I think most Australians would like to see government being more innovative. And
what have you got in mind there?
Well, look, I wrote today in the Australian about the sorts of things we can be doing in healthcare. We are not dealing effectively with the growth in chronic disease. We're not dealing effectively with the increasing demand on our hospitals. And all around the world, there's innovations happening, some from government, some from the private sector in other countries, which we can make use of, and we can contain those spending costs. Look, technology is allowing us to do things better for less. And anyone working in the private sector now is seeing this every day. They're having to do it every day. We're not applying that in government. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. If we don't do that, we can't deliver an effective tax reform package which prevents a tax hike.
But is there really enough to be found in technology through health spending that's going to bring that spending down?
Yes, I'm absolutely convinced of it. The simple maths of it is that spending has been growing at about 4% a year. we have to get it down to about 2.5. That's 1.5% productivity gain each year. The private sector's been doing that for years. It is not that hard, but we've got to confront our spending demons, and we've got to talk about innovation in government. I'm very confident we can do that.
Presumably you're talking to the Health Minister, Susan Lee, about these ideas.
Well, you know, it's every big spending portfolio where we've got to do this. We've got to do it in health, we've got to do it in welfare, we've got to do it in education, we've got to do it in defence. Wherever there's big spending, there's opportunity, and as a government, I think if we can learn to innovate in government, then we'll provide precedents for how the private sector can do it as well.
Now, you arguably should be on the front bench, but you're a backbencher, so you're free to speak your mind. Your priority then is to do more on the spending front than go anywhere near the GST?
Well, I think if you do more on the spending front, then you have a lot of freedom on what you can do on tax reform. Because if you know you can contain spending growth, you also know that you don't need bracket creep to fund growing government expenditure. You can reduce income tax rates, and you can change the tax mix so that there's less reliant on income tax and company tax and more reliant on consumption taxes. You can do that, but you'll never get the package right without confronting those spending demons, and that's why Scott Morrison today talks so much about competition policy, because a big lever to manage growing spending in the public sector is competition policy.
But let me put this to you. If you are going to protect the most vulnerable, as both the Treasurer and the Prime Minister say they are, and that includes pensioners who don't pay income tax, the only way you can protect them when you put up the GST is to help them out with a higher pension or some other sort of payment, right? So you're putting up the GST, you're increasing the payments, you are increasing the size of government.
Well, no, not if you are managing your spending.
Right.
And that's my point. You can't deliver a package which contains spending, gets a better tax mix, compensates the vulnerable, unless you're containing your spending. If you're containing your spending...
Which sounds great, but it hasn't proven to be that easy. There's no silver bullet in bringing down spending.
Look, I mean, I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can all say now that some of our attempts to reduce spending growth were directionally correct, but, you know, too brutal, too ideological, and I think if we can be much more pragmatic about it, which again is what the private sector's done, I think we can get those. We can contain.
Well, just give me a practical example, though. I mean, how can you actually save a dollar?
Well, you know, I gave an example in this article today where the Australians spend 60 to 70% more time in hospital than benchmarks from overseas when they get a kneecap replacement. Right, 60 to 70% more time in hospital now. Hospital costs are huge. They're very, very significant costs, probably the fastest growing cost in the state and federal government budgets.
So we should be getting people out of hospital sooner.
And you can't do that by just pushing them out. You just do a series of clever things to get them healthier faster. And then on the other side, you can actually manage chronic disease through the primary care system, through GPs. To keep them out of hospital in the first place, whether they're a diabetic or they've got cardiovascular disease, you can actually manage chronic disease through the GPs, and this again is happening all over the world and increasingly starting to happen in Australia. That keeps people out of hospital. Now they're really significant the costs of hospitalisation, and we can manage this through just doing clever, sensible, reasonably pragmatic.
Presumably, this overlap in health spending between the primary care and the hospital care is something the Federation Review's been looking at under this government. Kevin Rudd had his own big health and hospital review that ran forever. I mean, this stuff has been looked at, hasn't it?
Well, it has, but the problem hasn't yet been solved. And it's true that the countries that are moving fastest on it are the ones where they've got an integrated system. In the UK and New Zealand, for example, they're doing a lot of this kind of work. And so we do have to deal with this as a federation. And you know, quite rightly, and Scott said this in the speech today, we are working very closely with the states on this package, and we have to, because they have to be part of the solution.
Now, getting back to the tax side of the equation, though, when we talk about the GST, there are various ideas. You put up the rate to 15%, or you broaden the base to health and education and fresh food. What's your view on that one?
Look, I think this is one of those issues to be worked through. I think it's unfortunate that we've spent our time debating that before we've even got to what the problem is we're trying to solve and how important it is to contain spending growth, because I think they're the fundamental issues, and then the question of getting the GST mix right is almost, to me, it's secondary. You know, obviously there are issues about looking after the most vulnerable, making sure that it's a fair package, which the Prime Minister's talked about in the last couple of days, and that they're important issues. But I think they come second. I think first of all, you've got to be clear about what benefits are you trying to deliver. Lower income tax, contained spending, lower overall tax.
When we come to the budget time, we all look in the budget papers. You can see the line item there, tax as a proportion of GDP, and I think it's nearly 24% at the moment. It's, I'm sure in your view, too high. At the end of this tax reform process, whatever the government decides to do, are you saying that that number should not go any higher than it is?
Yes.
That must be lower.
We need to contain it. Because what you're effectively doing every time you increase that is you're making government bigger. And I think Australians believe that we can do a lot more with the money we're already getting. And that we should be able to deliver the health and education services with the money we're already getting, and they can see a fair bit of waste in the way we're going about it. So yes, I think the aspiration absolutely should be to contain that overall tax take.
Angus Taylor, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Dave.